Taking a look there at our nation's capital, a live look. We do have so many questions now on this update that we were able to get from the NTSB. And now we're joined by former Marine Corps aviator Ron Alvarado. Ron, there was so much new information that came out today in that press conference. What did you ultimately take from it?
Well, this is not the preliminary NTSB report, but it's the conclusion of the on-scene NTSB report. So they're gathering as much data as possible from the cockpit voice recorder from the UH-60, which revealed a lot of good information. But still, this investigation will take months, could be up to a year to complete. But what was discussed today actually verified a lot of my suspicions of what occurred during this unfortunate mishap.
And let's talk about that communication, because that's been a huge sticking point. We do know that the air traffic controllers and a military helicopter had some issues with those communications. I want to put up this tweet that we have there from Fox News as well, showing that the Black Hawk crew may not have heard that message to pass behind the DC-bound plane before the midair crash. How common is it that you could have some sort of discrepancy and not receive a message that ended up being so critical in this situation?
It happens all the time. Even as a airline pilot, there are pilots who are stepping all over each other, especially in very congested areas like JFK, New York, Philadelphia, DC, because everyone is trying to communicate their instructions, repeat back instructions, requests for certain altitudes or directions. So it happens a lot. So therefore, it's very important to comply with air traffic controls instructions previous to all radio calls. So what I believe occurred, according to what we've heard today, the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter pilot keyed the mic, the communication mic, drowning out some critical information from air traffic control, the tower primarily.
And when that situation happens, you're saying they can't hear. It happens all the time. We were just showing some of that footage as well from that midair plane collision. In situations like this, are you solely relying on the visual then in that case if you're not hearing that communication? Is that why it's so critical? Because we also know that those pilots on the Black Hawk, they believe, had on their night vision goggles the entire time, which they said could have also impeded some of their vision.
So I think I've mentioned this during our last report together. I believe a week ago, you and I spoke. Here's what keeps people and helicopter pilots and the flying public safe on these routes. Route 1 heading south over the Potomac from Key Bridge and Memorial Bridge, it is paramount to fly the appropriate altitudes. Now, I know there were some discrepancies with the altitude because of the radio altimeter and also the barometric pressure elevation altitude indicators. But if pilots fly their correct altitudes or lower, for example, when I flew these routes at night, especially on NVGs, night vision goggles, I kept my altitude at 100 feet, and I was always scanning it outside, inside, but primarily my radio altimeter, ensuring that I'm no lower than 100 feet and no higher than 200.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because the word altimeter was brought up several times during that press conference, also talking about the radio altitude, which you just described as well. 100 meters. Why is that so important when you're in the DCA area? Is it because planes typically come in higher than that? Is that the whole purpose of flying at 100 and why it's critical?
Yeah, so again, it's very important to fly below 200 feet. If a pilot or anybody, you could have access to these charts. It'll say on the route what altitude you should be flying at. So for the location that they're at, they should have been below 200 feet. So whether they were getting false information or erroneous information from their flight instruments in the flight deck, the NTSB will find that out. But as an extra safety precaution, when I was flying those routes years ago, when I was at the Presidential Helicopter Squadron, I made it a habit to fly 100 feet, no lower, and no higher than 200 feet. And I would always reference my radio altimeter, because at that altitude, that is the most accurate instrument to relay to me where we are in space over the terrain.
I'm glad you mentioned that. because it does just seem like they were mentioning in the press conference that their equipment could have been malfunctioning. So in that case, you're saying that you have to rely on multiple sort of instruments to ensure that you're on the right track. Is it possible that you can see one measurement on one instrument, another is giving you one? What would your thought and your process be if that was to be the case?
Well, these pilots I'm sure they're very highly qualified and trained, God rest their souls, but it is very important to keep an instrument scan. What does that mean? That means you're referencing multiple indications in your instrument panel. You're looking at your heading, your direction, magnetic heading, altitude at that location near DCA. That is the most important instrumentation. Your altitude above the terrain, above the river, and your altitude making sure that you don't exceed 200 feet absolute ground altitude or above sea level, so you don't infringe upon the flight path going into DCA, which, again, it looks like that's what occurred, but we can't speculate at this point. But from what I did hear from the NTSB, there could have been some erroneous data that the pilots were referencing. And also the ADS-B, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, as mentioned by the NTSB, it was not sending signals from the UH-60.
And that's devastating because so many lives were lost in this crash. I also want to bring up something that may change in the future as far as it goes as legislation. Right now, we do know that since that January 29th crash, the Federal Aviation Administration has prohibited most non-emergency helicopters from flying near the airport. Right now, they're proposing that they might make this temporary ban permanent. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's a move that is necessary in this day and age to avoid another tragedy?
I personally don't think it's required. I just believe that air traffic control shall continue doing the good job they can. When properly manned, they'll instruct helicopters and low-flying aircraft traffic where to go, what altitude, and to be aware of other aircraft in the area. But also, the onus is on the pilots to know the rules of the road, know the route structure, know the altitudes or frequencies where they need to be. Pilots need to build a very proper and strong situational awareness. That can only be done by referring to their instruments, listening to the communications, also working as a team inside the helicopter, inside the cockpit with the other pilot, with the air crew in the back. It is a constant flow of information between the pilots, air traffic control. But again, I believe that measures like this shouldn't be taken, restricting military aircraft from entering the airspace, because this is our nation's capital, and there are very important people that need to get in and out via military helicopter. So again, whether all these squadrons in the DC area have to be retrained in how to fly these route structures around the DC area, whatever it takes to keep these pilots safe and adhere to standard operating procedures, it's got to be done. But again, I don't believe that all helicopters should be restricted from entering that airspace.
And Ron, before I let you go, we also know that the NTSB is planning on releasing a preliminary report on this accident in the coming weeks. What do you expect? What information do you expect to come out of that? And what we've been waiting on. Again, it feels like we're getting piecemeal bits and pieces as the investigation is ongoing. But this preliminary report, what can we expect to see in it?
Well, typically after an unfortunate mishap as we experienced over the last several weeks, the NTSB will release within 30 days a preliminary report. Typically, it's about 4 weeks after the incident. And this is just a very high altitude, 30,000 foot level, if you will, of what occurred, how it had occurred, but not really speculating. So they're just going to release the information they have, and they're going to reiterate what they've spoken about today during the conference, but hopefully they've got a little more information to provide in that report to give everyone who's involved in this investigation a little more visibility of the hows and whys this unfortunate incident occurred.
And hopefully just a little bit of peace as well for those victims. Again, Ron Alvarado, retired military corps aviator. We appreciate you for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Your expertise has been great in breaking down the situation and some of the terms that are thrown out in those press conferences. We appreciate you for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, we did want to get that story in for you here on Live Now from Fox. We're going to take this opportunity to step away for a 2-minute break, but we're going to continue on with some of today's top stories on the other side.